to music for technology. Let's give Gerard Mathis and his group a round of applause.
This first number I'd like to dedicate to Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, who made possible beautiful electronic sounds. The next piece has the musical equivalent of a mirror image called echo, and I chose this because it is the kind of the idea in humankind to look at ourselves in mirrors to decide who we are. And it is also part of the piece will be the reading of an African myth about technology.
In the beginning, Muluku, the supreme being, made two holes in the earth. From one came a man. And from the other, a woman. Maluku gave them land to cultivate. A pick, an axe, a pot, a plate, and millet seed. He told them to cultivate the ground, to sow it with millet, to build a dwelling, and to cook their food in it. Instead of carrying out Maluku's advice, they ate the millet seed raw, broke the plates, put dirt in the pot, and then went and hid in the woods. Seeing that he had been disobeyed, Maluku called up the monkey and the she-monkey and gave them the same tools and advice. Build a dwelling, work the land, grow the millet. They built a dwelling, worked the land, grew the millet, cooked, and ate it. And Maluku was well pleased. So he cut off the tails of the monkey and the she-monkey and fastened them to the man and woman, saying to the monkeys, "Be men," and to the humans, "Be monkeys."
My next little number is another little piece by Vivaldi, but it's nicknamed the Voice Male Concerto. You'll see why.
Gerard messages, press 1. To get messages, press 2. To administer personal greetings, press 3. Old messages. Call received 8:54 a.m. Thursday, March 25th, 100 seconds. To listen, press 0. To delete, press star D. To skip, press pound.
This is Tom once again, and it came to me in a vision. When I get 2 3s instead of 1 7, in other words, you can
Call received 12:13 p.m. Friday, March. Call from Oswell Hall. Received 204. Gerard, it's Dorinda, and Virginia would like to talk to you about if you got hold of the program review people. Call from Help Desk. Call received 4:49 p.m. Monday.
Yes, Gerard, this is Robin. Hi. I'm working in the Finale application on my computer, and every time I go to enter notes in the speedy entry, I hit the caps lock and I keep getting a tree error. This has become very frustrating. I can't continue with my work. Could you please email me with instructions?
Call received 4:14 p.m.
Hello, Gerard. This is Victor over at the Long Air Record Store. Calling to let you know that the CD special order is in. We hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Deleted. Call received. I'm just calling to remind you that we've got that school meeting today, Alexander's IEP, and it's at 3:30, so I'll see you then, and I might be a little late, so can you pick up Alexander after class? Thanks. To respond, call received 2:53. Call received 4:57 p.m. Thursday, April. Call received 11.
Hi, Gerard. This is Travis, and I had a question about the piece that I'm writing, and I guess I'll just call back later. Thanks.
To respond or no more messages. To record messages, press 1. To get messages, press 2. To administer personal greetings, press 3.
Forgot to introduce. The speaker on the African piece was Robin Smith, and our drummer here is Ryan Johnson, and it's not his brother, but the bass player that's going to play with me on this last number is Andrew Johnson. And this is a piece that was originally a fiddle tune, and I was going to rewrite the words that I sing, so it was some song about the Y2K bug, but it didn't rhyme very well. So instead about Y2K, the song's about Y1K, which is the millennium we're in right now that's just about to end.
Centuries. It was here, but now it's gone, but blowing in the breeze. Fairly well, Y1K, fairly well, I've gone. Fairly well. moving on. Oh, I-1K was 1,000 years, it's never coming back. It was a once the present day, but now it's in the past. Fairly well, Y1K, fairly well, you're gone. Fairly well, Y1K, it's time you're moving on.
Let's hear another round of applause, please, for Gerard Mathis and his techno group. Good morning, and welcome today to the 29th Annual Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series at North Idaho College. I am your host today, Mona Klinger. Before we do anything else, however, this is going to embarrass him, but I would please like Tony Stewart to come forward wherever you are. Tony? Tony? We need to congratulate this man. He has just given birth to his 29th baby, the Popcorn Forum this year. Tony is the brains and the brawn. He is the visionary for the Popcorn Forum, and he's also the heart and soul of it. And for all that you participate in this week, we have mostly Tony to thank. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you, Tony. We have an exciting morning planned for you. In fact, we have an exciting morning and an afternoon. But before we do anything else, I would first like to introduce our ASNIC president, Ben Taves.
Thank you, Mona. I want to welcome all of you to the 1999 Popcorn Forum. This is an exciting week for all of us here at NIC. And first I want to talk to you a little bit about why ASNIC, which is the Associated Students of North Idaho College, support the Popcorn Forum. We support the Popcorn Forum both in spirit and financially, and we do that for a reason. We believe that the Popcorn Forum gives students something that they really need, something that college is really all about. More than just a career and money, going to college is about learning how to make decisions, how to live, how a philosophical structure that we'll use for the rest of our lives. So ASNIC sees that as a very important cause, and that's just what the Popcorn Forum does. A man once told me that wisdom is predicting the future using past and present situations, attitudes, feelings, results, and thoughts. I think that the Popcorn Forum plays a role by showing us the past so that we can make future decisions. It helps us to understand the present and to change the future for the better. So by understanding the past, we, the students of NIC, as well as the community, are able to understand ourselves better, understand what we want for the future better, and develop a decision-making process that we can use the rest of our lives. The Popcorn Forum plays a role in guaranteeing that the next millennium will be a better one. And that's all of our hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the president of North Idaho College, Dr. Michael Burke.
Good morning. It's wonderful to see such a crowd here this morning. In all honesty, I've been waiting all year for this morning. I'm very thrilled that this event has finally started this week. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome each of you to the 29th Annual Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series Symposium, hosted this week by the college. During this week-long journey through time, you're about to meet an unparalleled cast of travelers who will be joining you on a whirlwind trip through the last millennium. Travelers such as Galileo, James Watt, Martin Luther, Thomas Jefferson, Eleanor Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Madame Curie, Karl Marx, Queen Elizabeth I, a citizen of Tenochtitlan, Georgia O'Keeffe, Johann Sebastian Bach, Catherine de' Medici, Pope John the 23rd, Simone de Beauvoir, and Sigmund Freud, to name just a few. I hope your seat belts are all buckled, because this will probably be the most exciting trip of your life. As a relative newcomer to the area and to the college, I'm amazed to discover that this forum has been going on for 29 years, which, if I did the math correctly, is about the same time I began my undergraduate career, which is a humbling thought. I find that this longevity is a particularly noteworthy testimony to the foresight of the founding members of this forum, who are part of the NIC community, who, amidst the social and political upheaval of the late 60s and early 70s, decided to focus their attention not on the present, but on the foundations of Western civilization. For almost 3 decades, the organizers of this event have focused on the great events of our collective history. And they have focused on the great individuals, male and female, who through their intelligence, their vision, their courage, and their personal integrity have shaped the world we live in. Moreover, the format of this symposium embraces the college's commitment to impassioned discourse, where divergent and often conflicting views are both expressed and investigated. This commitment to inquiry is, to my way of thinking, really the heart and soul of the collegiate experience about which Ben just spoke. I hope each of you leave here this week enriched by both the content and the spirit of this journey through time. I'd like to take a presidential prerogative and take a moment to thank those who've made this marvelous event possible again this year. Obviously, Tony Stewart, who was really the prime mover behind this. I think Mona Klinger's been a little modest. The Popcorn Forum Committee has had a lot to do with it. The members are Mona, as well as Kurt Nelson, Sue Shibley, Tony Stewart, Karen Streeter, Dorinda Moore, Linda Erickson, and Joanne Matthews. Obviously, ASNIC has had a significant contribution to make to this event, as well as the NIC Foundation. Funding from the Idaho Humanities Council, which comes down to us from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as Jan Benoit on our staff, who helps write that grant every year. Obviously, we wouldn't be here without the NIC theater staff, as well as the auditorium staff, working behind the scenes with the NIC video production staff, making all this possible, as well as the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and countless volunteers and participants who have going to be working all week to make this happen. I was told that our art students, under the direction of Allie Vogt, spent some time this weekend coming up with this wonderful set that you see behind us. I think they deserve a thank you as well. And it's an amazing set design, very clever, I think. Together, they make this journey through time possible, and I think we're all in their debt today. Again, welcome one and all, and I hope you enjoy the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. I would like you all to take a look at your programs. This is our very first of the week. And right up front, I would like to invite you all back to all the rest of the programs. There's programs in the morning, the afternoon, at night. They're totally without charge. They're free. You can bring your friends, your relatives, your moms, your dads. There's a seat for you. You don't have to make any reservations. The more people, the better. The more ideas we're going to be able to talk about and discuss, and looking on our past and also to our future. So I invite you back. We're going to get into our very special guest presentation in just a few minutes. We are going to have the renowned mathematician Galileo here on our stage in just a few moments. He will speak to us for about a half an hour, and then you, our audience members, will have an opportunity to ask questions of him. The question and answer period will invite you to field questions to Galileo. I would also, though, like to remind you, on this day of science and technology, that at 1 p.m. in our new beautiful student union, we will have a response panel where some of the most famous scientists and inventors of the millennium will be there to speak with you, and an opportunity to speak with them in a question and answer period. So please come back at that time. Now I would like to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Galileo. He was a Paduan mathematician. It was said of him, Galileo was an early crusader for the paradoxes of science against the tyranny of common sense. Think about that for a moment. In other words, Galileo's telescope defied reason. For the first time in history, in the entire history of mankind, because of the telescope, one could examine an infinity of objects that could not be seen by the naked eye. An astounding invention. At this point, I would invite you all to come journey with us to the past. And please, welcome with me our esteemed guest, Galileo.
The College of the Sacred Faith have forced me to announce the errors of my ways and to publicly state that I did not observe the motions of the Medicean planets around the planet Jupiter, that the stars do not move, that they are in perfect, unchanging order in the celestial spheres. But they do move. And they may say I cannot teach. They may not let me publish my works. But I tell you, the stars do move. As this matter goes, I do not believe we can use the Bible as a text for science. But instead, we must use the evidence of the senses and other demonstrations that may be necessary through the use of experiment. For I say to you that both the Holy Bible and the phenomena of nature come from God. They are two great books. The Bible is holy writ, but the book of nature is the observant exegesis of God's action and Word. Well, good morning. My name is Galileo Galilei. You may call me Galileo. And I suppose that it is no great surprise that I found myself after 1610 in particular controversy and would remain in that controversy for over 30 years up until my death in 1642. Nor is it any great surprise, I suppose, that even at the age of 70, I found myself defending my beliefs and even possibly my life before the College of Sacred Faith, what is perhaps better known to you as the Inquisition. How did I come into this place? For indeed, I have always thought of myself as a devout Catholic and a great believer in the power of the great Creator and of God and of the miracles of God and of religion. And I believe that nature is a demonstration of the great power and the perfection of God, but that it can be perceived through the gift of reason that God has given us. Some say I have started a revolution, that I will destroy the church, and I do not believe this is so. But I will tell you that some 500 years before my time, the church thought it had another revolution, for indeed the great Thomas Aquinas reconciled the teachings of Aristotle, who taught of this world and of the use of reason and of the evidence of the senses. And these beliefs were reconciled with the faith and revelation of the church by St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, he was made a saint because of his work. And for 500 years, we have enjoyed the benefits of the Aristotelian logic, the Aristotelian method of inquiry. But now it seems to hold us back from finding new knowledge, new evidence, new demonstrations of the perfection of creation. And yet I would have to tell you that on that evening in January 1610, when I took what was called a spyglass at the time, upon which I had made some slight improvements, I could see roughly 60 times further and 20 times larger an area than the spyglass from Amsterdam that I had originally been able to find. I had learned how to grind my own lenses. I had developed a system of concave and convex lenses. I had increased the, the ratio of length between those two lenses. And as a result of that, I had begun to explore the heavens. Excuse me. I had begun to explore the heavens. And the first thing that I explored was the moon. Now, according to the theories of Aristotle, everything beyond the earth had to be perfect. It had to be in an absolute order of circular spheres, circular motion, and of course, everything rotated around the earth, including the sun. Well, as I explored the moon, I first of all noticed the surface of the moon was not smooth like a great spherical ball, that instead it had what I thought were mountains and rough surfaces. There were even dark spaces, which I thought might be seas, and light spaces, which I thought might be the land, for I imagined that if I were able to look at the earth from afar, that is how I would see them. Now, you see, even there I was still being an Aristotelian, because I was making assumptions based on logic without demonstrated evidence. But still, I also began to notice that there was movement of shadows upon the moon, which meant that the earth was moving. Well, how could the earth move if it was a stationary center of the solar system, or even of the whole universe. But on January the 7th, 1610, I turned my telescope out into the starry sphere, as they called it. I had looked at what was called the Milky Way and had been interested to find that the great masses of light were actually separate stars. But on this particular occasion, I was looking at the planet Jupiter, and I saw 3 pinpoints of light. 2 to the east, 1 to the west. The next night, January 8th, all 3 of those pinpoints of light were to the west. A few days later, I only observed 2 to the east, and I thought that perhaps the other one must be behind the planet Jupiter. Well, I had begun to come to the conclusion that these stars, what I called the Medicean stars, were in rotation around the planet Jupiter. Well, how could that be if they had to be in rotation around the Earth? And then I finally saw 4 stars, 3 to the east, 1 to the west. I also observed that the planet Venus seemed to have phases, which again would not seem to have been possible if the Earth were not in motion. I realized that something that I had believed privately for some time had suddenly come before me. There had been a theory published just before the death of the theorizer that the Earth was not the center, that instead the Earth and the planets were in rotation around the sun. This was called the heliocentric theory, from the Greek word helios for sun, as opposed to the geocentric theory, which would put the Earth at the center. And I believed I now had evidence, demonstrated visual evidence, that the theories of Copernicus were correct. I had written to the great Johannes Kepler, the assistant to Tycho Brahe, one of the great astronomers of my time, that I had been a Copernican for several years. And I wrote this letter about 1598 to compliment him on his latest book. And in 1604 to 1605, there had been a great nova observed. And I had suggested that the nova was not a permanent feature, that indeed it was a matter of change in an explosion of a great star, and it would soon no longer be visible. Well, this too went against the ideas of Aristotle, which talked about a perfect, unchanging universe. It challenged the conception, at least the church thought, of God as being all-powerful, as being a creator of a perfect universe beyond the earth. I did not believe I had done anything to challenge faith. In fact, I thought I had done things to increase the wonder of God's creation, to show the great hand of God's wisdom in allowing for the growth and the change of the universe in order to enhance His creation. That was all part of a great divine plan. And so in 1610, when I published my book, The Starry Messenger, I found myself involved in great debates over this issue of whether or not Copernicus' theories were right, and secondly, whether or not Copernicus' theories were heretical, that is, to the point that they challenged or even disputed faith and the holy Word of God. Well, from my earliest days as a student, I was called the challenger or the questioner. I seemed always to raise these questions, even during my school days in Pisa and in Florence. I had been born near Pisa, but my family had moved when I was a young boy to Florence, where my father, Vincenzio, was the court musician to the Medici dukes. And I would have to say my father, Vincenzio, has something to do with my challenging and inquiring nature. Because Vincenzio Galileo, and that was a name given to my family about 2 generations earlier, it was a type of minor nobility that we had come into. We were originally just common rug makers called bajunto. But because of services by a wealthy grandparent of mine, we had been given minor nobility, and my father had been educated as a musician and did most of his work for the Medici court. But my father challenged the old musical ways, the old mathematics of music, to develop a greater sense of harmony, of what you would call counterpoint. And he did this by mathematically demonstrating the various relationships between the notes. He measured the vibrations of the notes. And I would frankly say that if anyone would like to understand what got me into trouble, it was this compulsion for measuring things. From the time I was a student, I had been wondering how often things did their motions, how fast they did their motions, how far they did their motions. And I kept discovering that we had no means by which to measure these things. So I began to invent tools by which we could measure phenomena in nature, to weigh it, to determine its length, to determine its width, to determine its speed. And of course, in being able to do that, I began to come up with explanations of the phenomena. Now, I suppose that everyone here has heard about my determination to study the laws of motion by dropping 2 objects of unequal weight from the Leaning Tower of Pisa while I was a professor there between 1589 and 1592. I didn't do that. One of my admirers took an experiment that I proposed similar to that idea, and then proceeded to tell people that I had done this. But nonetheless, I did run an experiment showing that objects of the same material but of different weight did not, as Aristotle say, have the heavier one fall faster than the lighter one. But given the same medium, the same lack of vacuum, or the same presence of resistance, when you dropped objects of the same material of unequal weight, they would arrive at the point about the same time. In other words, the pull of what would later be called gravity was constant, regardless of the weight of objects of similar material. Well, of course, that created a great deal of controversy at Pisa, and I was quite pleased to leave Pisa in 1592 to take a much better position as professor of mathematics and natural philosophy at the University of Padua near Venice. Well, I think it's there that I really began to become a Copernican because of things that I began to observe, not through a telescope, but about the motion of the earth, motion of objects on the earth. I became quite a student of the ancient Greek philosopher and scientist Archimedes, the one who said that if you could give me a place to stand and a lever, I could move the earth. And Archimedes, of course, had done a great deal of study on motion and on weights and measurement. And I really felt that he, more than Aristotle, was the scientist that we should be influenced by from the ancient times. It was at Padua that I created quite an income for myself by working with the military in designing bridges, in designing fortifications, and particularly in helping them make better use of their artillery. I developed something called the geometric and military compass, by which they could create triangulation of their weaponry. They could create measurements for elevation and for distance, all with one tool. I think in your time, there would be some equivalent between my military compass and what you used to call a slide rule, which I understand most of you don't know what that is today, because you have so far advanced in your abilities at measurement and calculation. But that actually made me a little bit of money, and my consulting with the military did as well. I was receiving a fairly good salary, about 400 florins. In your time, a florin might be worth $100 or so. So I was getting a quite decent salary, $50 to $100. It's hard to tell this many years since my time. But I also received some additional money, but indeed I had heavy financial burdens. As the oldest of 7 children, and with my father now dead by 1595, I was responsible for the dowries of my 4 sisters. And my 2 younger brothers, I would like to say this gently, they were incompetent. They were unable to raise money. They were careless with the spending of money. So I found myself supporting my mother, my 2 brothers, and providing dowries and making good marriages for all 4 of my sisters. I had also, somewhere around 1600, begun, I guess what you would call a relationship with a woman named Marina Gamba. And we had 3 children. My 2 daughters went into orders. They became nuns. And then, of course, there was my son Vincenzio that I had to educate and buy positions, and he was often my assistant as well. Marina Gamba was a woman of Venice. Venice was not so far from Padua. And when I left Padua, finally, about 1609, to go back to Florence, she remained in Venice. But I took the children with me and completed their raising. But I had many happy times in Padua. But Padua was the place of peace before the storm. And even there, I had a lot of controversy. I talked about the Nova while I was at Padua. I created my thermoscope, a version of what you might call a thermometer, based upon balls of glass with various liquids in them that reacted to the temperature so that the balls would float up and down inside fluid, and one could then calibrate the temperature. I also did a lot of work on the motion of water and on flotation. I did some work with magnetism as well. My method, while many want to say I was a great experimenter, I was not particularly a great experimenter. I did try to go beyond simply using logic and assumptions the way Aristotle did, but mostly what I would do is I would observe things, come up with a mathematical explanation, and often I would not test that. But if I felt that I needed a test, then I would devise some rough check. I did begin to agree with the ideas of Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, that we really needed to experiment over and over again and not to assume that one experiment proved our point. I was not particularly good at trying to do more than one experiment. But I guess some feel that I started us on a scientific method, which basically said you do not make assumptions based on logic. You instead examine those assumptions with both mathematics and experimentation. And I believe it was that reputation for mathematics, particularly in the areas of motion and weights and measurement, that brought me finally to Florence, to the Medici court. My pupil, Cosimo de' Medici, had become the Grand Duke of Tuscany. His capital was in Florence, and I was the chief mathematician and court philosopher. And it was there that I did my work with the telescope. It was there that I began to argue about the whole Copernican theory. In fact, I had a great debate with a scientist by the name of Krebs over sunspots, whether or not the sunspots were a part of the sun or simply motion on the surface of the sun. Of course, if they were motion on the surface of the sun, that would support Copernicus's theory. And finally, by 1615, I was denounced to the Inquisition for the heresy of my views. And I was called before the Inquisition in Rome. I had written a letter to the mother of Cosimo de' Medici, the Grand Duchess Christina, to reassure her that I did not see my discoveries as attempting or even being in conflict with religious faith. And it was to her that I made the statement that there are two great books, the Holy Bible and the Book of Nature. They're both written by God. The Holy Bible helps us in faith. Nature is the observant executrix of God's word and action. Now, that word observant executrix, let's break that down a moment. Observant, we all understand that word. That means it's something you can see, something that you can observe in nature. Whereas executrix, that means she who does something. In other words, she who acts. So in the actions of nature, we could observe God's word and action. And I had many friends very high up in the church. I particularly was helped by the Barberino family, particularly Maffeo Barberino, who later would become Pope Urban VIII in 1623. There's some dispute over what the decision was in 1616, and that did not come to light until about 17 years later. What does seem to have come out of that 1616 was that I was not to hold or defend the ideas of Copernicus. That meant that I wasn't to publicly support those ideas. And so for the next 7 years or so, I basically did my teaching. I explored a variety of non-astronomical problems. I did not get into the Copernican issue. I did privately discuss these matters with my friends, and I was writing a book called The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems, the Ptolemaic and the Copernican, by which I hoped to look at both sides and show that the Copernican system was both a correct system and not one that threatened the Catholic faith. But I could not publicly talk about that book for the time being. However, in 1623, when Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII, I applied to him for permission to publish my book. Much to my surprise, he refused to allow me to publish it. He said it could only be published if I simply stated both opinions and offered no attempt to persuade on the issue of the Copernican opinion. Well, I told him I would do this, and in 1630 my book was published and immediately censored and removed from publication. Pope Urban VIII felt that I had betrayed his confidence, and between 1632 and 1633 I spent 15 months under the inquiry of the Inquisition. And I was convinced that whether the fact that I was 70 years old and sickly and near death or not, they were ready to burn me at the stake as a heretic. I was convinced of that. It may not have been their desire or case, and in fact, a nephew of the Pope was one of my great defenders, and he persuaded and he arranged that I would simply be put under house arrest, not allowed to publish or teach, and would not be tortured. And so I spent the last 7 years of my life in that condition. I did do a little writing. Finally, in 1638, I wrote 2 books which were not published until after my death. And those books were basically on 2 new sciences, one on motion and one on the strength and resistance of materials, what you might even call kind of civil mechanics to this day. Well, at that point, I also had visitors, particularly from the heretic country of England, the poet John Milton, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and both of these men arranged for the publication of my great work, The Dialogue of the Two Chief World Systems, uncensored, complete, shortly after my death. It was published in England and in other Protestant countries. And so I did feel like my ideas would live on, although they were totally censored in the area where the Catholic Church held power. Well, I say to you that there is this great book called the universe. And it must be studied, but it can only be studied if we know its language and its characters. And the language is mathematics, and the characters are circles and triangles and other geometric shapes. And without knowing this language and these characters, our lives are spent in ignorance, and we are in the darkness of a great abyss. Those stars do move. God is great, and He has given us reason to explore the majesty of His greatness. Thank you. I would be pleased to answer some questions.
Thank you, Galileo. Now, what an opportunity here at North Idaho College in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, to ask some questions of Galileo. Would anybody like to field one? You can just stand up. Thank you. Why didn't your wife move with you?
I had no wife. We were not married. She was a woman of property. She was quite content in Venice, and I guess the most delicate way I can put it, she had other prospects for companionship after I left, as she had had other prospects for companionship before I came along. Some other questions?
Right there, thank you. Yes.
I believe I heard that. Well, you speak a little bit of a foreign tongue to me, sir. That latter theory I was not acquainted with, nor had anyone suggested it in my time. I would say that even with such a theory, I am not sure I would feel that need challenge faith, because I would consider the miracle of the act of creation itself, and whether that creation took place over exactly 6 days as we humanly know 6 days, or if it took place over a greater amount of human time, who knows what God's spiritual sense of a day may be. I think that that only science, however, can give us the details or even the assurance of the wonders of God's work. If we read nature as God's work, then we also must know that nature will be compatible with God's spiritual plan.
There's a question there. Thank you.
I'm Italian. What can I say? I believe it must have something to do with the heritage of the Greeks and Romans, who basically portrayed the deities of nature as goddesses. And perhaps that just simply entered into our poetic license, I guess I would say.
Another question. Thank you. Right over here. Yes. How did your theory go over with the sailors who had been using the stars to navigate for centuries? Is that correct?
Well, of course, they did not have the telescope, and so the stars they were using were basically stars that, from the naked eye, could be seen as being relatively a fixed point. In fact, I hypothesized that some of the great stars might move, but they might move over hundreds or even thousands of years, and therefore their motion might not be of any visibility. And I made statements to that effect. So I really don't think that I had much impact on sailors, except they started using the telescope. And that was renamed in 1613 the Galilean telescope. And the great difference was that I ground the lenses to use concave and convex lenses. Now, I've been told that actually, if you use two concave lenses, you get even better results from the telescope. I did not think so. Again, this is one of these things where I had pretty good reasoning, but from a wrong assumption. You know, I was in the process of starting a new way of doing science, but others improved on that during my lifetime and after my death.
One more question, please. Did you concern yourself with the speed of light?
I had no conception of that. I understand that a young man born the year that I died, by the name of Newton, began to talk about that to some extent, but I'm under the impression from being back that was actually something that only in this century was there great study of this phenomenon known as the speed of light. I had no concept of that. In fact, I regard time as basically a fixed and unchanging type of duration. And so I had no sense that time itself could be flexible or change.
Because of time, what I would like to do right now is to have our wonderful character break character and introduce you to Frederick Krebs. Mr. Krebs is a professor of Western and Eastern civilization in a community college in Kansas. He does over 10 characters, such as Galileo. He averages over 60 lectures a year. He's an author, and he's also a scholar. We'd like to have him speak as Mr. Krebs, but first let's thank him as Galileo.
Are there a couple of questions I could answer as the person behind Galileo, perhaps even addressing a couple of things that Galileo might have, I guess the word I would use, pussyfooted around? Yes.
Did you personally appear in the Inquisition?
Yes, I did, and it was a very difficult journey for me because I was in great pain and not well. And in fact, we put that off at least twice for about 6 months each time before I finally went to appear.
Yes, we have a question right down here. Thank you.
I should not say I now. I'm no longer Galileo. Excuse me.
Yes.
Okay, Galileo died in 1642. He was born in 1564, and he died January 8, 1642, and he was born on February 15th. So that would mean that that means 1564 to 1642. He was not quite 78 years old, which is quite a long time frame for that time. But he was not in good health most of his life. There's some thought that working with the bridges and the dampness and water as he did in the 1590s actually created a chronic bronchial chest condition.
What were some of the other inventions that you made?
Well, some of the other inventions, I think, of Galileo that are probably the most important, the military compass was extremely important. His work with a thermometer was important. He actually developed a way of calculating vibrations that became, I think, the foundation of measuring the human pulse. And that was, I think, extremely important. The book he wrote at the end of his life about the two new sciences actually set the whole stage for what we would call civil engineering, in talking about strength and resistance of materials, in talking about motion of materials. Extremely important for engineering. He is not a particular influence on the development of the calculus. Both Newton and Leibniz would have been involved in that, and that was some 50 years after his death.
Yes, thank you. Another question. Was there any other invention in even the next 2 centuries that were as controversial, the last 2 centuries, as controversial as what Galileo got involved with his telescope?
Well, I would say that Darwin's theory of evolution would certainly rank in that kind of controversy. In fact, my own studies and reading Stephen Jay Gould, I really think that Darwin's whole concept that human beings are animals, that he really doesn't talk about the role of a deity in the process of evolution, has had a tremendous effect far beyond just talking about science. And I think the jury is still out on what the idea of the space-time continuum is going to do in terms of the way we look at art and ethics and government. I mean, what happens if we basically say there are parallel universes and suddenly we have this idea that everything is being changed and we have to consider time, the past, the present, and the future as part of our physical data when we're making decisions. You see, what Galileo gave us was a three-dimensional universe, and it's all in space. Time is a constant, so it doesn't count in the way we observe things. And most of us are still living in a Galilean, Newtonian universe. We're not living in a universe where we have to take time into accountability when we observe things. And the jury's still out about how that's going to change the lives of the ordinary human. I think it's going to be more profound than Darwin or Galileo.
And I'm very sorry, we do have to take time into consideration here.
Yeah.
And so we are at the end of our program. Thank you so much for coming today, and please, we hope to see you at many other sessions over the week. And let us again thank Mr. Krebs for coming today.
Be there at 1 o'clock?
Be there at 1 o'clock. Thank you. You were wonderful.
I'll get my watch back. We'll be all set.